In America during the 1960s and 70s, psychology was steeped in a culture of diagnosis, categorization, and separation. Traditional therapy often focused on individuals and their struggles, isolating people's minds from the world around them. Treatment was something done to people, and mental health was something you either had or didn't have. The field of psychology reflected a society split along lines of race, class, and conformity. But for many, this approach didn't resonate with the complexity of their lives. The world was shifting, civil rights, anti-war protests, new visions of community and solidarity were sweeping across America. And out of this turbulence came a new, radical voice in psychology, Dr. Fred Newman. Who was this man who dared to question the established methods? Who saw that the old ways of fixing people were falling short?
Fred Newman was the public philosopher and activist who, for 40 years, translated the most progressive aspirations of the 1960s into effective tools for social and personal transformation. The core of Newman's work in culture, psychology, and politics is the capacity of human beings to continuously create the conditions for our own development. Newman's cutting-edge discoveries and accomplishments generated controversy throughout the length and breadth of his activism. He was branded a cult leader, a self-hating Jew, a brainwasher, and a political opportunist. But despite his critics, Newman's unusual blend of rigorous, postmodern philosophizing and practical on-the-ground organizing have made him a lasting, if still controversial, architect of a new progressivism. Born in 1935, Newman grew up in a predominantly Jewish, working-class area of the South Bronx. His father died when he was 9, leaving his family destitute, and he earned what money he could at a variety of jobs. The years he spent working in machine shops, where he learned the skills of precision toolmaking from his older brother, turned out to be a key source of his commitment to creating environments in which everyone involved can participate in creating their own tools.
Fred Newman is a dear, dear friend of mine, someone I love and admire more deeply than I could possibly express. Fred and I have the kind of bond that comes from growing up poor and never forgetting where we came from. I grew up in Chester, Pennsylvania. Fred grew up in the Bronx. We both lost our fathers when we were young and came of age in families struggling hard to survive. We both became the most highly educated members of our families.
Newman briefly attended the City College of New York before enlisting in the U.S. Army at the age of 18. After serving in Korea, He returned to City College to complete his undergraduate education and then went on to Stanford University, where he completed his doctorate in the philosophy of science in 1962.
Some of the great thinkers, particularly during this century, some of the people who I most idolize, the great Soviet psychologist Lev Vygotsky, who is one of my great intellectual heroes, the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who's one of my intellectual heroes, said, no, we are not just what we are what we are together with what we are becoming. And the insistence that we are what we are and only what we are is a part of that Enlightenment culture, that paradigm, which has to be transformed and is, in my opinion, now transforming. One of the spokespersons of that Enlightenment thing put it so eloquently, a fellow named Bishop Butler, who said it this way, and I always love this quote. He said, "We are what we are, and not another thing." But that's not true. Because, as Vygotsky has pointed out and others have pointed out, we are what we are, to be sure, even as we are what we are becoming. And that understanding have led some psychologists following Vygotsky to create whole new approaches to education and learning and growth, which are working for more and more children and more people throughout the world.
After leaving Stanford, Newman embarked on a short-lived career teaching philosophy, first at Knox College in Illinois. He subsequently taught at several other institutions while becoming increasingly active in the anti-Vietnam War movement. He began giving all A's to his students so that he would not be complicit in sending his male students to fight in Vietnam, and he was, in due course, fired from all of his teaching jobs. By 1968, Newman had decided that this form of protest was inadequate. He left academia to become a community organizer and began creating organizational tools that directly challenged the authoritarian institutions that cripple human development. For over 40 years, Newman served as the leading builder and toolmaker in a growing community of activists who shared a commitment to human development. This community has created and/or inspired dozens of political, therapeutic, educational, and cultural projects, most of them financially independent and community supported. One such project was the Castillo Theater in New York City, a revolutionary departure in progressive community theater. One of the many ways that Castillo challenged the institution of theater was that the plays it produced, many of them written by Newman, and their production were organically related to the process of building the development community of which Castillo was a part. For example, people who had never performed on stage before were cast alongside professional actors. At the same time, performance was emerging in Newman's social therapeutic work as a critical human capacity that helped ordinary people, not just actors, grow and develop. Philosophically, the evolution of Fred Newman's mature perspective was inseparable from the evolution of the development community that he led. The perspective is most fully articulated in the trilogy, co-authored with the developmental psychologist Lois Holtzman, that concludes with the book, The End of Knowing, a new developmental way of learning. The influences of the early Marx, the Soviet psychologist Lev Vygotsky, and the later philosophy of Wittgenstein were all prominent in these works. Newman's views on the central political issues of our time, poverty, racism, war, and the democratic process itself, frequently had much in common with the positions of other progressive intellectuals. Social therapy, the clinical approach that he founded, bears a family resemblance, as Wittgenstein might say, to the work of many postmodern critical and humanistic psychologists, including the social constructionist Kenneth Gergen.
It's sometimes said that the truly creative work in any discipline takes place at the borders, by those who understand the convention of that discipline, but who also understand something else. It's at the borders that we also find individuals who are free enough from the tyranny of the normal, you might say, those patterns of expectations and obligations and sanctions, that they take risks. Fred Newman is just such a border dweller. In certain respects, you can see Newman's professional life in terms of, let's say, border travels and his concerted attempt to explore new potentials, new ways of approaching knowledge, theory, methodology, and as well the place of psychologists in historical, political, cultural, and aesthetic contexts. These explorations have also been accompanied by a singular willingness to take risks, to move on from talking about ideals and alternatives to precedent-breaking action. In his building of a community-based institution, is generating a new form of therapy, forming a political party, writing and producing plays, organizing forums for public debate, and countless other ways. Newman and his colleagues have surprised, unsettled, and antagonized. At the same time, they have placed into orbit a galaxy of new stars, images, institutions, and practices that leave us ever wishing for more. For me, one of the chief contributions of Newman's work lies in its shift away from the traditional view of the person as living within the private psychological world, that person trying desperately to communicate with others, living in their worlds. Rather, we're invited to see the individual not as a separated part from the social surround, but as integrally related. Drawing from the works of Wittgenstein and Vygotsky, for example, Newman sees us as intimately tissued with each other. Psychology and social practice are one. And if psychological functioning is essentially the living out of social practice, then psychological process is essentially the grounds for social performance. Now, with this, you can see more clearly why life can be looked at as theater. Now, for Newman, this is scarcely to say that the only goal of life is theatrics. We're speaking here, on the one hand, of a full flowering of human potential, and on the other, of challenging the social and economic conditions that suppress these very potentials. Now, I've joined Newman in writing together. Loved that experience. It was stimulating and enjoyable. Yet, in the end, what was really most important for me was his response to our points of disagreement. Now, for me, the litmus test of any body of ideas are the way they're carried out in practice. And it's very easy enough when your surrounding community agrees with all of your ideas. The more difficult challenges come when you face those who differ. It is in these dances of difference that I really came most fully to appreciate the performative movement that Newman and his colleagues have crafted. My voice of difference was neither ignored nor annihilated. Rather, it was treated as an integral part of the play. Now, without difference, there's scarcely drama. And without drama, what is life is theater?
In electoral politics, Newman was an early pioneer of what has become the rapidly growing postmodern American independent political movement, which challenges the partisan duopoly and in which he remained until his death an active tactician and power broker. That Newman was a uniquely polarizing figure suggests that it was not merely his ideas, but his ability to give them practical expression and build political and organizational support for them that most outraged his critics.
Hi, Ruben. Thanks for getting together with me to share some of what Fred Newman has meant to us.
Yeah, Morgana, I'm glad for this opportunity. You know, whenever I think about Fred, I recall a paper he wrote on the illusion of the self and his comment on Descartes' famous cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And Fred said that it could be, I'm having a ham sandwich, therefore I am.
That's quite funny.
Yes, Fred was funny and serious at once. And this is serious for humanity, the thinking species, Homo sapiens. So he countered that perhaps thinking is not what makes us human.
Yes, indeed. And you know, that makes me think of how impressed I was by his talk on Who Wants to Be Normal, about how being normal as dictated by the ruling society and is not necessarily healthy or developmental, that it's a personal issue to develop a critical analysis of what it is to be human.
So Fred used humor to get across some challenging and important concepts.
He did. I didn't ever get to meet Fred, but after 3 years with this community, it has become a personal goal to get to know him. I find he put out the notion of development, that all people can perform a head taller than they are, kind of like growing a plant.
Mm-hmm. You know, in a residency, I got to talk to Fred about his work. He was an intellectual engaged in practical activity and who lived a regular life. He led with the wholeness, holistically, and with spirituality, which is the activity of trying to live your life in the way that you are trying to bring about. This is a way of living developmentally.
And he showed that we can be revolutionaries in every phase of life, and that everywhere is a stage. And it's about stepping onto stages and performing. And that is the developmental way to live. Working class culture for the whole world. There's a way that makes that into something else, close to the ground, like a human, ordinary revolutionary. And he showed us that humans are changers, and that normal activity can be completely revolutionary.
Yeah, he definitely was a powerful intellect in the real world.
And usually working class people who get degrees pull themselves up and out of the working class, but Fred kept his working class values.
Yes, he did. You know, I have been trying to bring Fred's and his community's work into my work, as I do workshops in gender issues with men, learning other ways of performing masculinities, trying to overcome the oppressive and violent masculinities that many of us as men have often learned in patriarchal societies. How about you, Morgan? What is Fred in your work?
Well, I find that as an intercultural youth worker, my work is about bringing people from different backgrounds, different cultures together. And I really appreciate how Fred understands identity as something that's politically shaped by the world, but that's something that we shouldn't let define us. And that feels really powerful to me. And I think there's also something I like about how he philosophizes about everything with everyone, even and especially with the people who would never have thought that philosophy was something that they could engage in. I find that so powerful.
That's great, Morgan. Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you, Ruben. Thank you, Fred.
Yeah.
Fred Newman spent his life building things with other people. The most important result of his activity is that today there are many, many people continuing his work, or as Newman would say, following Vygotsky, completing it. Not finishing it because, in Newman's view, it will never be finished, and no completion is ever definitive or final. We who are making this video are a few among Fred Newman's completers. We have no doubt that many of you watching will be, or already are, among the completers too.